I've listened to musicians, and when you listen to young people, kids, learning how to play piano, for example, there might be a piano student who plays every note perfectly, and it's not nearly as beautiful as the piano student who makes a couple mistakes, but just has this love and emotion that they put into the play. And I'd rather listen to the one with a couple note errors because it's so much richer. And I think that's true when we talk about our habits. Our habits will be really so much richer when we strive for excellence instead of perfection.
Hey, you found yourself in The Groove, a podcast where we create space for reflection and conversation to unfold. We explore the human experiences that connect us all to deepen our understanding of ourselves, our connection to the world, and the ways we engage with the aliveness within us. We're glad you're here. All right, here we are back in podcast land.
Yep, and we've got some exciting work ahead of us today. It's going to be great.
Yeah. So before we jump in, let's give a quick intro. I'm Carly. I am an artist and a creator.
And I'm Chris, and I'm an educator and a life coach.
And in this season of the podcast, we're exploring structures that create space for us. So in the episode just before this, we explored zones of growth. And in this episode, we are going to be actually breaking this into two parts, because what we thought was going to be one episode is really quite enough content to make it worth having two parts to this. And what we're going to be exploring as a structure today is habits. And in this first part of this two-part series, we will be kind of really taking some time to explore what habits are, maybe some different lenses through which we can play with this idea of habits. And then a lot of the ickies, or like the points of friction that we can often encounter as we're starting to implement new habits into our lives and into our beingness. And the second part of the series is going to be really exploring a more sustainable application of habits that we can play with that might be a little bit outside the norm for us, but that you and I have talked about and played with a lot as we've started to bring habits into our own life.
Exciting. Here we go.
All right, so let's start with defining a habit. I always like to start by defining what exactly it is that we're exploring. And I pulled this definition from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. And it says, or tells us, that a habit is a settled tendency or usual manner of behavior. And I'm just going to pause there.
Yeah.
And let's sit with this for just a quick second. And is there anything that you would like to add on as we're exploring habits?
Yeah, I think habits are really interesting because they ultimately create our results. So the habits that we repeatedly perform, and that's part of what a habit is, bring us to our results. And sometimes they're the results that we want, and sometimes they're results that we don't want. And I think really important to even become aware of what are the results we're looking for so that we can align our habits to get the results we want.
Yeah. I also think about habits as the structures we build to support our growth and flow. And habits as something that we can actively work with than feel like we're actively working against.
Yeah.
So you have some really great insights about habits, habit building, habit forming, patterns, all of that good stuff.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about kind of this structure of what a habit is.
Yeah. So, I always think of a habit loop when I think of habits. And there are really three parts to this habit loop, and probably a lot of our listeners have heard of them. But there's the cue or the trigger. There's something that happens that triggers the performance of your habit. And there are a couple things that might do that. It might be a certain time of day. So for example, before I go to bed, there's a routine I have. I brush my teeth, I wash my face, and it's very, very ingrained in what I do. And so that's a time trigger. Another example of a trigger is a location. So you might be in a certain place, in a certain room of your house, at your desk at work, wherever it is, and it's a location trigger. So when I'm here, this is what I do. Another one is a preceding event. So, maybe there are multiple things that you do at a certain time or in a certain location, and that's kind of a prior event or stacking a cue. Your emotional state, which is also a really interesting one, because sometimes we think of all the things in the external world, but an emotional state can be a cue for your habit too. Example, you feel anxious, so you bite your nails. That's a trigger for a habit. And then lastly, other people. So you may find that when you are around certain people, you have certain habits that get triggered, or in a certain environment with people. So these can cross over each other as well. And then, of course, there's the second part of the loop, which is the routine. What is the behavior that you're engaging in? What are you doing when you get triggered or that cue happens? And then lastly is the reward. There's some kind of payoff you're getting for whatever it is that you're doing. So that's kind of the loop of a habit that comes into play when we're thinking about how do we develop our habits, how do we break habits. That's basically it.
So basically, what I'm hearing you say is a habit is kind of a three-part structure where we have the cue or the trigger.
Yep.
Then we have the response,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have the reward.
Yeah.
And that's really how we can understand what a habit is in its most basic sense of being.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And we'll definitely be bringing that in later in the podcast too, how it applies to those different steps.
Awesome. So let's zoom out a little bit. I want us to play with habits, especially around like zones of growth, and maybe playing around with some of these other structures that we've played with before.
Yeah.
So I think about habits as structures that help us create rhythm in our lives.
Mm.
And I think this pulls away a little bit from habits as really strict routine that like kind of chops our day up. One thing I've also been starting to think about is, where does a habit exist in our zones of growth? And I think this is a really interesting question, and I'm just going to pose it to you.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting question. I think when you have a habit that's really well practiced, it's in your comfort zone, so much in your comfort zone that it's actually subconscious. You don't even think about it anymore. And a perfect example of that to me is, have you ever driven to work, a place that you go all the time, and you get there, you pull in the driveway, and you don't even like really recall how you got there?
Yep.
That's one of those subconscious habits. So I think that's when it's in your comfort zone. I think when we're taking on new habits, it brings us into our growth zone, because we have to be more thoughtful about it. We have to be more planned about it, and really have a structure for why we're going in that direction.
So here's one of the things that I've been thinking about is, can we make it a habit of getting into our growth zone?
Yeah.
Can moving into our growth zone actively become a habit for us?
Yeah. And it's such a good question. And I think yes. It's a little bit more of our internal state that we're talking about, and how do I approach things and how do I approach my life? But I do think you can make a habit out of getting into your growth zone. You have to bring that to the front of your mind and start really planning for it.
Can we have a habit that actively brings us into our panic zone?
Yeah.
Can getting into our panic zone be a habit?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I really do. And when I think about panic zone, there's the true meaning of the word panic, where you're either freezing, fleeing, fighting, like you're really at a high level of panic. But I also think there's a lesser form of panic. We can't really get into our own groove and flow when we're in this place. And I think it's a high judgment zone. It's just whether we're judging ourselves really harshly or we're worried that other people are going to judge us harshly. I think it brings us to a place where we're really going to struggle with our habit. And we're not in this groove with it of being in a growth zone and really exploring it openly and in a way that helps us grow.
And I think we can very quickly get into a habit of judging ourselves.
Mm.
And this kind of leads us into that part of building new habits might be unraveling old habits.
Yeah.
And in this case, unraveling judgment as a habit is something that's really at the forefront of my mind these days.
Yeah.
Because I think, as we've said, judgment is something that moves us into a panic zone, or at least moves us out of our growth zone.
Yeah.
What's really cool to me is what we're kind of starting to explore is that we have maybe some different categories of habits that we can play with. So we have habits of action that might be a habit of the time we wake up or go to bed, a habit of how we move our bodies, a habit of the food that we put in our bodies, habit of hobbies that we engage with. Then we also have these kind of more internal focuses of habit, which are maybe how we think, how we talk to ourselves, how we perceive ourselves. And I think judgment starts to fall into that category. So as we keep exploring this, I'm really, really curious about creating an understanding of habits that reduces judgment, increases curiosity, and opens up space for us to build new habits.
I love that. When we have these internal ways of being, talking to ourselves, and how we talk to ourselves is a habit. And it's also one that we are the only ones who might know what that habit actually is. It's not something we're necessarily wearing on the outside of our body, where those external habits you talked about, you can see it's identifiable not only by yourself, but by other people. And the habit of what's happening inside of you is only privy to others if you let them in on it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then to me, the question becomes, how do we create that internal habit space to be as conducive and supportive to the habits that we want to build externally, that they're in conversation with each other?
Yeah.
So really quick, as we're really exploring habits here, I want to make it clear that we're exploring habits as spaces to play in and to be curious with, not as pass or fail systems of judgment towards ourselves. And I think that's a really important distinction to make here. So we kind of have a working definition of how we're playing with this term of habits, this structure of habits. Now let's explore how we engage with habits, both in this current moment in ourselves, maybe how we've seen an understanding of habits unfold, and then where do we want to go with this? How can we help habits serve us? Let's start with the lenses through which we view habits. I kind of see this as being rooted in two ways. And as much as I don't like a binary, let's play with this right now, knowing that these two binaries have tons of tributaries that they could look like. So it's just the containers with the caveat. What I see is that we can have habits rooted in love and inspiration, or habits rooted in fear, anger, maybe even control.
Shame,
Huge one. And I think often our habits are built around achievement, giving ourselves something to measure ourselves against, and therefore judge ourselves against, accomplishment, and external validation. And what I want to do is play around a little bit with what might it look like or sound like if we build habits and view habits as an opportunity to commit ourselves to a process, then attach ourselves to an outcome. And maybe we start by, and I would love to hear from you, how have habits served you specifically?
Well, one of the first things I think of is there are ways that habits have served me in a really productive way, and ways that habits maybe have served me in what may seem to be an unhelpful way. So I think some of the habits that really have served me, one of the things I've been doing for a lot of years is I get up really early in the morning, and within an hour of waking up, I get a workout in. And that is a habit that serves me so well because after I work out, I feel energized, my head feels clear, and I can get to whatever work I'm doing that day in a more efficient manner. So it's just something that feels really good for me. So I think that's an example of a habit that I think is really productive and creates space for me.
It's rooted in the sense of serving and honoring yourself.
Oh, totally. I think that's a really important distinction, because if that very same habit of working out can be done through a lens of inspiration, and it can also be done through a lens of shame or anger towards self. And how you go about that matters so much, because one is, in my opinion, more sustainable, at least for me, versus if I'm shaming myself into working out, that it feels like something entirely different. It's not energizing, it's actually detracting.
So have you ever had a relationship with working out in this habit that is more rooted in shame or fear?
I would say there may have been times that it was rooted a little bit more in shame or fear. And it's really the shame or fear of, what does my body look like? And am I lean enough, or am I fill in the blank enough? Ultimately, am I good enough the way that I am? Which drags me, that then the habit feels like a drag. Where if I'm doing it because it makes me feel good inside of my body, on the outside of my body, it serves me in a multitude of ways, then it's easier to stick with and engage with, and easier for me to listen to my body when I'm doing it from that lens.
Yeah.
I'm curious about you. Do you have habits that you're thinking about that really have served you in one way or another?
So actually, the first one that comes to mind, and this is a habit that has been kind of a journey for me to build, is the habit of giving myself time and space to really engage with my creativity as a high priority rather than as an afterthought. And that is something that I've had to work into as a habit of really being like, nope, this is really important time for me that I don't have to earn, that I have just for being. And the more that I engage with this habit, the more it opens and creates space for me to know myself, to understand the world around me, to engage with being alive, and to deepen my relationships. And so this habit of actually just honoring the time and space that makes me feel like myself has had this kind of extending reach into other areas of my life. And I think prior to me really understanding that this is an integral habit to my beingness, I did approach it with a lot more shame or a lot more fear or a lot more judgment, because I enjoyed it so much that I was like, I have to earn this. Like, this is something that I have to do X, Y, and Z in order for me to give myself permission to engage with this habit. And I think that's kind of a interesting thing, where sometimes I think we think of habits as the mundane or the things that we don't love doing, that we have to get ourselves to do because that's part of being alive. And that's true. But I'm also really curious about giving ourselves time and space to build habits that really feel enlivening to us.
It's less controlling habits and more opening habits is what you're talking about. You know what I just noticed in both of our habits that we talked about is there's this external part. For you, it's being creative, which, somebody probably could see in terms of your creating. And also in terms of me working out, like it's an external habit. But what we both talked about is what's happening on the inside of us that allows us to engage in that external habit in very different ways. That just struck me.
So this really brings me to the language of habits that we use. And what I was thinking about as you said that is the ways in which we talk to ourselves around and through habits, and how that does serve us internally that then projects externally. Because you can't get away from yourself.
No.
You are with yourself all the time.
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking a lot about how can we attune the agency of our tone and words to support the habits we'd like to build? What is this internal languaging framework, our self-talk, that we have autonomy over, that we have the ability to shape and sculpt to being a voice within us that creates safety, creates this feeling of groundedness within us. Because I think sometimes it's really easy for us, especially if we already have a habit of judgment, for that internal voice to really just like stick its talons in and like
grip, turn,
and like have the whistle in its mouth and the clipboard, and it's like crossing its arms and it's watching you. And I almost think of this as like our critic character that we can often default to, and the critic is so good at pointing out flaws. And we can talk a little bit about the critic later. But I want to talk more about how we can create an inner dialogue that is way more supportive to building habits, and where we can kind of open that. And
I'm immediately thinking about the panic zone and what we've been talking about, where judgment will bring us at least on the very edge of our panic zone, even if we're not in a literal panic state. But it shuts us down when we judge ourselves too harshly. And so I think recognizing, number one, that the harsh judgment doesn't keep us in our growth zone, which is a place that allows us to learn, grow, develop. And that includes building our habits. The other thing I'm becoming aware of is your own awareness of how you talk to yourself. And we've learned how to talk to ourselves from somewhere else. I think of my own upbringing, which was in a pretty strict, somewhat rigid household. And it took me a while to unlearn some of that judgmental expectation, which I think is different than holding yourself to a high level. Being judgmental about it is really different. And it took me a while to undo that and practice a new way of thinking about it. And what really struck me about that as I started working as an educator, and then later when I became a life coach, is thinking about who are my mentors, my really good coaches, no matter what you're getting coached in or mentored in, whether it's music, sports, whatever it is. If you think of your favorite mentor or coach and you think of how they talk to you, and then you reflect on how am I talking to myself? And if my mentor or coach talked to me the way that I'm talking to myself, would I think of them in the same light? Because if the answer is no, it means you need to shift something, I think.
well, this is making me think of how, as much as the critic is a character that we can have in our brain, we can have a character that is the model for our coach, mentor, teacher part of ourselves.
Yeah.
And as I'm listening to you speak, what's striking to me is the importance of having someone that we can model some of this self-talk after.
Yeah.
Whether that's a character that we've seen, whether that's a parent, whether it's a friend, whether it's fill in the blank, that we are giving ourselves kind of a template to work off of like, I know that this has felt really helpful to hear it in this way.
Yeah.
And our brains are really good at imagining new situations. Often we point our imagination towards what the critic might be saying. We can take just as much energy to point towards and explore what this character of the coach, mentor, teacher, space maker might be saying within our minds.
Two things. I think that's one of the reasons your reels are resonating so much, because it's a way of showing how you can hold space for yourself without judgment. The second thing is you can also get away from a mentor or a coach. You can't get away from yourself. That's what you had brought up earlier that I think connects with so well to this. You are with yourself 100% of the time. So watch what you're saying and pay attention to how you are interacting with yourself.
Yeah. And with that is the first opportunity of removing shame. If we are starting to notice our self-talk and we notice that it's a little harsh, I think the best thing we can do is just go, oh, that was a little harsh. And that's it.
Yeah.
There's no berating. There's no, I can't believe I was so hard on myself. That was dumb. I can't believe I said that. Because again, we're feeding into that cycle. And noticing how we talk to ourselves is the first opportunity to practice self-observation without judgment. And I think that that's a really helpful tool to have as we build new habits.
Yeah.
I also think a lot about when we start expressing a new habit that we want to build, we often know what we don't want anymore. I don't want to wake up late anymore. I don't want to not move anymore. I don't want to be hard on myself anymore. And that is a really great jumping off point. However, it's not the end of the statement of the habit that we're looking to build, because our brains get really muddied by negation. This has actually been studied. There's a study from NYU that I was looking at before this, examining how our brains respond to negation, which is saying, I don't want this, or it's not hot, for example. Like if we're looking at a cup of water or a mug of water and we say, that's not hot. Is it lukewarm? Is it cold? What is the water? We're not really sure. And we are better at moving towards something than running away from something. So I think about this as like negation creates confusion, clarity creates direction. So again, this negation, this I don't see this as a bad thing inherently, but more as an invitation for us to explore more about what we do want.
Yeah. There's a statement out there that goes like this: don't think of a red barn.
I got a red barn right here.
And so by saying that, you're actually directing your brain to think about the red barn. And so when we say, I don't want to wake up late anymore, or I don't want to feel shame, or I don't want to feel lazy, or I don't want to sit on the couch all night, or I don't want, what's the image that's being brought up is exactly what we're saying, instead of thinking of, okay, if I don't want to be sitting on the couch all the night, what do I want it to look like? What do I want to see happening? Because then you can start aligning. And you talked about clarity, and I think that clarity of direction is about aligning. And if you don't know where you're going, you can't align your action with what it is you're looking to move toward.
Yeah. So language is this great thing that can really help us. It can really hinder us. But the cool thing is that we have a lot of autonomy and ability to shift how we use language. So language, in a way, can become a point of friction or a point of smoothness. I want to just take a minute to address and reframe some other common points of friction that we've come across, and maybe you've come across specifically in your work as a coach when you're working with people who want to start building new habits. The first one that I think about is a false binary of success, failure within ourselves, and if we are achieving the goals that we've set out in order to support this habit or not.
Yeah. And that failure, success just gives you this checkoff point. Either I did it or I didn't do it. And for a lot of the people that I've worked with coaching, when they have that binary, if they happen to not meet what they were hoping they would meet, so it's the fail instead of success, it can really derail them from moving forward. Because I failed. Maybe I can't do this. Maybe it's too hard for me. So there's a lot of that self-doubt that will creep in when it's a simple binary of did it, didn't do it.
And that kind of makes me think of habit backlash.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about what habit backlash is.
Yeah. A perfect example of this is when I work with clients who have been dieting. And when I work with clients, it's really how do you develop a relationship with food that's sustainable? They'll share with me that when they've had really strict rules about a diet, they're good at it for a little while. And then something happens. And you think of all the cues we talked about before in the podcast, something happens and they go, I'm using my air quotes, off the diet. And they feel really guilty about it, or they're casting shame on themselves or really judgmental about it. And then what they share with me is what happens in their head is, well, I blew it a little bit, so I might as well blow it all the way. And then it goes down this rabbit hole of making things really difficult for them because they're now shifting to the opposite extreme. And that's what I refer to as a backlash. So it's too strict on one side. And so when the dam breaks on the habit, you go polar opposite to the other side and really undo it.
That could be rooted in so much. That could be rooted in the shame of getting pushed off, in the judgment towards ourselves. That barrier to re-entry in the habit, it just seems like it's getting higher and higher and higher. And again, we create that false binary of I'm either doing the habit or I'm not. And if it doesn't align with the intensity to which I want this habit to appear in my life, then I'm failing.
Yeah.
And let's play around with how we get ourselves out of that, and note that these points of friction that we've talked about are really integral parts to building a habit.
Yeah.
These are actually very normal things for us to experience.
Yeah.
And I think often we put this pressure on ourselves to embark on the journey of a habit and be perfect at it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not worth doing.
Yeah.
And
even more than not worth doing, maybe it's that we believe we're not capable of doing it. Because if I can't be perfect at it, again, that's the binary. If I'm not perfect, then I stink. And so it's reshaping that too. When somebody falls off of a habit train, I think the most important thing to do is slow down. Just breathe and notice what's happening and remove judgment. Just say, oh, what's happening right now? Maybe start thinking about what's the old cue I'm responding to? What's the reward that I'm looking for that was maybe something I've become really accustomed to having that I'm trying to fulfill? And without judgment, just to notice it. Because the noticing alone can allow you to slow down a little bit so that you can say, okay, I'm gonna just pause so I can refresh and get back on track of whatever it was that I was working toward.
the noticing creates space.
Totally. Without judgment.
Without
It's
judgment.
just noticing, so it slows it down.
Which is even a habit that we can build, is the habit of noticing.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the habit, you're building a new habit.
Meta habits. So something that I think a lot of folks navigate is perfectionism. And it's ultimately it's wanting to be really good at this thing.
Yeah.
And I think it can also kind of tread into, if I'm not really good at this thing immediately, it's not worth doing for me. Or it's, if I'm not perfect at it, then I'm not good enough.
Yeah, I think that's the bigger issue. Usually what I find is people find the habit change-worthy, but for some reason they start to believe, especially if they're perfectionistic about it, that I can't do it. I'm not good enough if I'm not perfect at it. And I would really encourage people, if you happen to be a perfectionist, start thinking about the difference between being really good at something or excellent at something versus being perfect at something. I've listened to musicians, and when you listen to young people, kids, learning how to play piano, for example, there might be a piano student who plays every note perfectly, and it's not nearly as beautiful as the piano student who makes a couple mistakes but just has this love and emotion and energy that they put into the play. And I'd rather listen to the one with a couple note errors because it's so much richer. And I think that's true when we talk about our habits. Our habits will be really so much richer and serving ourselves in a really beautiful way when we strive for excellence instead of perfection.
Perfectionism puts us right in the perceived binary
Yeah.
of, am I being perfect? And if I am not perfect, then I am not.
Am I good enough or not?
Right. Right. And there's so many more ways. There's always a secret third option.
Yeah.
That is the perfect example of there is a secret third option, and the vibrancy with which we can play, accepting that we might make some mistakes, far outserves us than if we hold ourselves to the standard of perfection in rigidity.
Yeah. It's not nearly as fun either. You know, when
Right.
you're really holding yourself to that perfectionistic standard, and I think we've all done it. We've all done it. It's just not as fun.
Perfectionism lives in the zone of judgment,
Yeah.
which is
yeah.
right. It's outside of the growth zone.
Totally.
It's that constantly moving finish line where you're like, I can see it, but I'll never get there because every step I take, it also gets a step further.
Yeah.
And really, it keeps us right on that bridge of judgment and panic towards ourselves, and really eliminates the space that we have to grow in our growth zone and ability to be there for a little while. So I think once we can get ourselves into the secret third option, outside of the binary of perfectionism or not perfectionism, we become aware of all the points of friction that are going to be part of this process. And what I really want to press on here is that friction is what creates like fire and flame and energy. That friction is actually very integral to us building a habit rather than signs to exit building the habit. I see friction as an invitation far more than a denial of
something
the process happening.
It's something to be curious about and notice and play around with instead of judging and going to that binary. Yeah.
Yeah. So in all of these kind of points of friction that we've just named, what we're really going to be playing with in this next section is how friction can open us up, how friction can become part of this process as we actually start building habits.
Yeah. And with that, how can we soften some of the friction to make it easier?
Yeah. When I think of building and sustaining habits, I think about them as an invitation to more deeply understand ourselves and the ways we want to engage with our aliveness. So again, it's this habit as a structure that feels opening rather than habit as a structure that controls, shames, and restricts. And I think one of the really helpful ways that we start to break out of habits that are restrictive or habits that are really externally located in an external recognition or loci of control is getting to the root of why we want to build this habit. How is this actually serving us?
Yeah, that's such a, like, why? Why do you want to do something? That's such a good question to ask yourself. And not just one why. I think you need to ask yourself why several times. So we typically ask the first why and we answer it, and then, okay, yeah, and we move on. Why else? So that you can get a really well-rounded picture of all the things that creating this new habit is going to open for you.
I almost see identifying and starting to build a new habit in like a couple different steps. And I'll offer them and maybe we can kind of explore them. So a lot of times somebody will know what they don't want.
Mm-hmm.
Then we might ask, okay, what do we want? We explored that. The next thing, after we've maybe gotten to a couple whys, and this is what we're really looking for, is what are we looking to feel?
Yeah, that's one of the whys.
This habit.
Yeah, for most of us, I think when we're thinking of taking on a new habit, there's something on the other side of having that become a habit that gives us some kind of a feeling. And I think that one's really important because it's ultimately, we want to feel good in this world, and we want to feel good in our skin and comfortable in our skin. And in some way, shape, or form, the development of that habit brings us to a place where we have probably some positive feeling that we anticipate we're going to experience. Yeah.
And then at a high level, once we really understand what we're looking to feel, then we start to be creative around how we can create structures that will support that feeling
Yeah.
for ourselves.
Yeah.
And that kind of 4-act structure is where I see habits being built in a more sustainable way rather than setting ourselves up for habit whiplash.
Yeah. And it's more playful. You just get to play around with it a little bit more instead of that binary of either I did it or I didn't do it, or I'm good enough or I'm not good enough.
I want to press on the structure
Yeah.
a little bit more. And one structure that I have found really helpful when I'm building a new habit is something that I like to call scaffolding.
Mm-hmm.
And scaffolding is something that I see as a guiding, supportive structure that we can use to interact and right-size the intensity of our habit building. So it takes us out of this idea that a habit has to look a certain way for it to actually be a habit. Our actions have to look a certain way in order for us to be supporting a habit. And it instead widens the scope of how we can engage with the habit that is consistently moving us towards, and breaks down the binary of if not 100, then 0.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I look at scaffolds as kind of these tiers to just kind of create some containers. And when we start with understanding what a habit is, often we go to our ideal representation of how this habit is going to appear in our lives. So for example, I'm going to switch examples into something maybe that feels a little bit more accessible for a lot of folks. My ideal habit that I would like to bring into my life is that every single morning I get up and I work out for an hour and then I meditate for 20 minutes. That's my ideal.
Yeah.
Like if I could start every day like that, I would know I was really successful in that habit.
Yeah.
So many of us, for whatever reason, that's just not quite accessible all the time. But because we put this as this is the ideal habit, and if I'm not reaching this, and if I'm a perfectionist and I can't do that, then it's not worth me doing, or I can't do that for myself. Why do it?
Yeah, it's why by the end of January, all the fitness centers and gyms are no longer so overcrowded.
We create this really, really rigid, high-reaching goal that most of the time just isn't attainable.
Yeah.
And it then becomes something for us to consistently judge ourselves against.
Yeah.
And I want to break us out of that because we have free will, and there's always a secret third option of how we can engage with some of these things in our lives. So I have this ideal that I go and work out every morning for an hour and then meditate for 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Then if I swing to the other side, what is the bare minimum threshold? What is the good enough threshold that is, all right, I can commit to at least this?
Yeah, this is really important because real life happens, and that hour and 20 minutes that you just identified that you might want to spend on a daily basis just might not be able to happen for a variety of different reasons. And so thinking about what is the at least that 100% I know, no matter what happens, I can do that. So when you think about that idea of working out and meditating, and you go all the way over to the other side, what's the bare minimum that even if life gets a little hectic that day and things happen as they do, that no matter what, you can do this? What would that be?
I'll just rattle off some examples. I can do 20 jumping jacks.
Mm-hmm.
The absolute most bare minimum, I could do that. For me, that would be like I can do a 15-minute workout video of some sort, whether that's yoga, whether that is a HIIT workout, something that just, I could go for a walk.
Mm-hmm.
That's my bare minimum. Then what I like to do from there is find kind of this middle ground of what feels like most days I can do this thing. And maybe I go a little bit further. Maybe I pull back. But it's this opening of ways that I can engage with this habit that still moves us towards building this habit.
It's this continuum instead of this binary of either I did it or I didn't. It's where along that whole slide can you access that habit so that you're still building that habit muscle instead of this binary of either I do it or I don't. But where can I access sticking with this habit or continuing this habit that fits into whatever happens in my day, so that when life gets really hectic, as it does, I can still exercise the habit, even if it's not on the ideal end. It's at the very least, I know I can get this done.
I often think about how doing the minimum is still momentum.
Well said.
And I think it's really important that we give ourselves the space and permission to engage with the minimum.
Yeah.
And to really release ourselves from always having to do the most.
Yeah.
Because we can't.
It's
impossible.
Some days.
But even if you're
probably not most days.
And even if you are doing the most in one thing or one aspect of your life, you're probably not doing the most in all the other aspects of your life. There is only so much time and energy that we have. And I think as we're creating a scaffold, it's helping ourselves to build trust that we can move something forwards, even if it is in the minimum. And that becomes the habit that we really focus in on, is the habit of building trust in ourselves through the building of another habit.
Yeah. And what's more important than that? You gain confidence in your ability to move something forward, whether that's a habit or something else. It also, we talked in the beginning about results. Like, habits are what bring you the results you have, whether you like them, you don't like them, they're neutral. And so it gives you this opportunity to develop confidence in getting the outcomes that you eventually would like to have.
I also think it's the importance of giving ourselves permission to celebrate these small wins and the trust that we're building within ourselves.
Yeah.
I think so often we hold ourselves to these really high standards that then when we meet them, we're like, yeah, well, I should have been doing that the whole time.
Yeah.
Rather than being like, hey, I just did that thing.
Right.
I just stuck with it. I just brought myself back to the habit and practiced bringing it into my life. And that also brings me back to this idea of friction as a really important part of building habits. Friction to me is a window that can be moved through to strengthen us returning to a habit. Friction is an invitation back to the habit.
Yeah.
And I think once we see friction not as something that pushes us away and makes us feel unworthy of continuing, but rather friction as something that can pull us closer, friction now suddenly doesn't become the enemy. It just becomes something that happens as part of the process.
And that you can notice it and be curious about it and start thinking about, what is the friction? Is there a way for me to minimize the friction? Is it just a friction I have to work through? Like, what is the friction? And now you're playing with what keeps you sticking with your habit and bringing you back to your habit instead of what might completely derail you.
Yeah. So we're talking a lot about habit building internally, but what do we do, or how do you handle it when people aren't supportive of the habit that you're building?
Maybe get new friends. Realistically, that doesn't always work. Depends on who it is. I think for me, I need to really know the why of my habit, and that ultimately it's for me. It's not for anybody else. And it's not that it wouldn't perhaps have a positive influence on somebody else, but ultimately they're for me. I also am really thoughtful about, when I'm developing a new habit, who I might share it with. If it's somebody who I don't think is really going to be in my corner supporting it, that's not the person I'm going to talk to about it. I'll find the people who are willing to support the habit for me. And then even so, you may have people in your world who just aren't going to support it. And I think it really goes back to that resolve of this is for me and I can maneuver through this no matter what anybody else thinks about me digging into this habit. It's not mine to worry about.
That makes me kind of think about how when we're in group structures, when we're in community, we will take on roles. We have these roles that we start to play for each other in a group setting, and they become our norm. They become the rhythm that we move against, work with, have chemistry with.
Yeah.
Especially across other people and in relation. And when we change a habit, that changes the rhythm with which we're interacting with other people, whether it's good or bad.
It's like a dance.
Good or bad, air quotes.
Somebody changes the way they dance. It means there might be other people who need to shift so they don't step on your toes.
Right.
I was also, earlier in the podcast, I was talking about cues. And one of the cues is the other people that we might be around. So there may be certain people we do certain things with, and that's a cue to do that thing. And when we change that habit, it might make it really difficult and just be a little bit of a friction point that we may need to shift how we're interacting with those people, or in certain circumstances to surround ourselves with people who are going to be more supportive of the habit.
Yeah, so I think as we're moving into building new habits, it is okay if things change and shift in dynamics around you as you build new habits, or as I would build new habits. Because what we're doing as we return to the why is understanding that the habits I'm building are to strengthen and create space for me. And it's okay if that shifts the way that people engage with me in space. That if I have my why strong enough, if I'm doing this with this intention and presence of enlivening myself.
Yeah, growing yourself, right? Being in the growth zone.
It helps us to accept that even if someone external to us doesn't necessarily love it or fully support it, that our ability to move towards this habit is not reliant on their support.
Yeah. Not easy.
Not easy.
And doable.
Yeah.
Especially when you start to frame it in the way that you just described.
Yeah, and it's again that habit of building trust within ourselves.
Yeah. That what we're doing is worth doing and that we're worth doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we kind of start to close in on time and the end of this, what's really been helpful for me as I understand habit is that they're really structures to support us living our favorite lives and embodying our favorite versions of ourselves. And as we approach habits from this place of deep respect and love for ourselves, of inspiration, that automatically crowds out the fear and the shame that we start to feel. And to me, it's just this deep trust in the process. Habits are malleable and adjustable to what we need in our lives, that all of us have the best understanding for our own lives of what habits would best serve us. And we can give ourselves the time, permission, and space to play with those as prototypes, as literal ways of playing with what we want our life to look like. And that even if we start to engage a habit, that doesn't mean we're married to it.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean it's going to serve our needs. That habit may serve a need in your life right now that maybe in a year it's not going to serve anymore. And so it's possible it might be best for you to let that habit go and bring on something different, maybe or maybe not.
So as we wrap this episode, I hope you give yourselves the grace, time, and space to really explore habits as a structure that creates space in your life and play with what that might feel like and start to release the need for habits to be controlling or constrictive. And remember that giving yourself this time and space is what builds stickiness to your habits. And the bare minimum adds to your momentum.
Well said.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Join us next time as we explore how we can apply habits in ways that feel more supportive and sustainable. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, or you can find us on YouTube at The Gnarliest Carly and at In the Groove Podcast. We would love to hear from you in the comments, or you can email us any questions at podcast@groovespace.co. If you enjoy reading blogs and our innermost thoughts, you can check out the Substack at substack.com/@thegnarliestcarly. You can also find me on TikTok and Instagram at, you guessed it, The Gnarliest Carly. Until next time, take it easy. This podcast is produced by Carly Wannerhide and Christine Wanner. Directing, editing, and filming by Erica Paparella. Support, show notes, and incredible questions by Kristen Pepin. Audio mixing and mastering by Tyler Paparella.